Welcome to the Mycelium Signal podcast. As always, I'm your host, Konstantin. Today, it's an honor to welcome Karl Haikara from Colorado, USA. Karl is not only the host of the Sol Nox Podcast, but also a musician and an artist. So, Karl, welcome to Finland. Spring has finally arrived here just in time for Walpurgis night, and while the Saint Walburga was revered by Christians for battling pest and evil spirit, it seems we are engaging in somewhat of an inversion, though thankfully we've dealt with enough pests like COVID. It might be interesting to share how we first connected a couple of years ago. I believe it was after your initial interview with Nas Alkamet of Oculus back in September 2022. Did I reach out to you first, or was it the other way around? I can't remember anymore.
I think you might have reached out to me. I think I remember Nas telling me that the guy from Finland who's into a lot of the same stuff had reached out to him about being on your podcast, and I found out about the podcast, and I went and listened to some of your early episodes that you had up, like the very first episodes, and then I found out you're also doing ones with Richard and everything, and then I don't remember. I don't think I either reached out to you or you reached out to me, and I remember
Yeah,
asking you to come on my podcast. Uh, but I don't
yeah,
quite
which I
remember.
did for like
Yeah, I think you might have. I think you might have added me on Facebook and stuff, and then we talked. Yeah, somehow we reached out to each other. So
okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I paid attention to your name and the Haikara, and I think I thought it was an interesting name, and or later I found about your Finnish roots, which we can speak about a bit later. But it's interesting that I appeared in your podcast for 3 times thus far. It was last year, I think.
yeah, so it would have been. Yeah, I don't remember when was the So the Richard Gavin episode was early 2023. So it was about a year ago.
Yeah,
Yeah, it came out. I remember I put out the episode of Richard and Nas on Walpurgis Nacht last year. That's what it was. Yeah.
yeah,
So
it was the Sacred Horror episode.
yes, which I put out on Walpurgis Nacht. Yeah. So I think so it would have been last year actually. So yeah, and I think like I said, I had you on 3 times. So one time in the summer, and then for how around Halloween, and then around Christmas. Yeah. So
Yes. So it was time to turn the tables, and I actually have interviewed Nas once and Richard twice thus far, and because of the new album of the Oculus, House of the Black Geminis, which is, I think it's released in 5th of July.
it's kind of funny how our conversations have worked out because one of them was close to Halloween, another was close to Christmas, and now we're doing this episode on literally on Walpurgisnacht. So it's kind of appropriate. Was not intentional, but it's very very appropriate. Um,
Yeah,
is of course Walpurgisnacht is the way I lay it out is of course like with like the old Celtic mythology of like you're basically splitting the year into 2 parts. So you have the dark half from Samhain to Walpurgisnacht, and then and then the light half of the year from Walpurgisnacht to Samhain. To me, that's kind of like the satanic invert. That's the satanic year. I know that people like Anton LaVey also look at it that way as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very it's one of those very powerful nights of being in between. On the
are
I
you
can't.
searching for liminal, perhaps?
Yeah, it's on that liminality. You're on that borderland. On nights like
Yes.
Mr. Samhain. You know what I mean? Halloween.
Yeah, I think this Walpurgisnacht, which is called Vappu in Finland, it heralded the spring finally because it was only some couple of weeks ago we got a sudden snow and lots of it, and cars were struck in the roads.
I think there's a whole reason like that. The liminal nights are kind of like the fearsome nights, but at the same time, they're very often celebrated bonfires and a lot of these things, right? And some older cultures, I don't know if they still do that, for belting and whatnot. But I feel like the night before, like if you think in Halloween as well, it's the night before All Saints Day, and it's kind of like this harvest festival. Well, this is the festival of new, like you said, of spring. We're starting to get past that point where we're gonna get snow here as well. Everyone's going to get snow in May, but in places where you have seasons, we're getting into that part. But I feel like there's just like a real darkness and power to these kind of liminal nights, and of course, it's no wonder that it was combined with the whole mythology of the witches' Sabbath and the witches on the Brocken for the night of the Bald Mountain, all that kind of stuff. So I just there's a lot of powerful mythology around Walpurgis Nacht. Do you think of like Section and Faust, for example, Goethe's
Yes.
Faust, and there's just a lot of real strong mythology, and I think it's becoming a little bit more known. There was a long period of time where a lot of people didn't even know about. A lot of people in this country, at least, weren't really too aware of Walpurgis Nacht, but I think it's kind of becoming a bit more into the
Yeah,
consciousness.
it's from Germany, I believe, from the Saint Walburga, originally,
Yeah,
apparently.
yeah, but I mean, a lot of those
Yeah,
mythologies and
yeah,
stuff are from Sweden and all kinds of places as well. So
yeah, it's celebrated in many European countries still. What is your favorite season when it comes to inspiration and art?
each season has its own kind of inspiration. Probably I feel most inspired in fall and spring. Winter, I get very inspired in different ways. I generally tend to veer towards different things during winter. I particularly paint a lot during winter, but I get a lot more music oriented from like spring through even through the summer, somewhat into fall. You know what I mean? So it just depends. Spring and fall probably the most inspiring for me. I guess it's those liminal times of the year. Winter, like I said, is very inspiring for painting, and I get more inspired into other directions. I guess like different types of directions in the winter. So I think each part, but if I had to answer, it'd probably be spring and fall.
Maybe it's like even something to do with hormones in the spring and this kind of stuff. And also during the winters, there's this isolation and introspection. I think it's the same for me.
Yeah, I feel like the winter inspiration gets more introverted. Like I said, I generally tend to end up doing a lot of painting, and the music and things I tend to veer towards is more. It's just like different like types of music that I guess has a bit more introversion to it. So I'll create certain types of things in the winter, but then I guess I feel a lot more expansive. Yeah, you get in the spring, you feel a bit more expansive, and I also feel like when the world starts coming back to life, there's like this kind of dark undercurrent to it that ironically has always meant that a lot of times period of time where I feel the most like inspired into black metal is usually the spring and fall.
Yeah, I think in the spring there is also some kind of like a masculine, virile aspect in the sense that you get more sunlight, and maybe, like I said, it has something to do with hormones with males at least, and that kind of stuff. It's for example in the spring at the pit. I'm recording from the sauna studio again at this old sauna cabin, and it's when I understand that it's spring, I can finally get back to the project at the pit because during the winter you can't dig anything because the fucking soil is in the permafrost. It's just impossible, and your time at the pit is limited. But during the springs, it's like I always seem to get some kind of megalomaniac project which I embark on during the spring, and then I continue it to the into the late autumn.
Right. Yeah.
I think many of our listeners might have guessed by now that you actually have Finnish roots by your surname Haikara.
Yeah. On my dad's side isn't entirely Finnish, so
Yeah,
my grandmother came here from Finland in the 30s. But my grandfather was born here because his my great grandparents came in from Finland in the late 1800s. So just a little bit removed from Finland in terms of generations, but
Yeah, but
Um,
you still have Finnish genetics running in your veins.
yeah, I'm pretty,
Finnish blood.
yeah, 50% pure Finnish, but yeah, you even have relatives in Finland and stuff that, from what I understand. So on both my grandmother and my grandfather's side. So, but unfortunately, I've not been able to make it up there yet, which is definitely on my list of things to do.
Yeah, I think you would like it here. And welcome to the pit when you do. There's still room. Like we have this Finnish saying that saunan takana on tila, which is directly translated that there's room behind the sauna, which is actually quite a grim saying. They used to butcher animals behind the sauna.
It's interesting with the sauna when you look at the mythology and history and folklore of the sauna and in Finland and Russia and those places. Like I have a book from that's pretty old. It's one of the few books. It's very hard to find books just about Finno-Ugric mythology and in its purest form. Like it's very difficult. But I have one book that's from the late 1800s that there was a tribe not too far from Karelia that was basically a Finnish tribe that was still basically practicing pagan practices there. And in this book has a lot of
Yeah,
their beliefs, which are pretty interesting, because it does tie into other things you can find in other forms of Finnish mythology. But the sauna was a very, magical place. It was a liminal place. So there was a lot of magic done in the pagan era. It was probably one of the places that they did sacrifices to the gods. It was basically part of temple and part of a place to clean yourself.
I believe they used to give birth in the sauna and
Yeah.
also wash the dead people in the sauna before the burial. And there's lots of mythology, of course, related to the sauna. There's also the sauna tonttu, which is basically some kind of sauna genie.
There's a lot of kind of grim folk tales about dark spirits and the sauna as well, taking people out from the sauna. And yeah, it's pretty interesting, like just how it's such an integral part of Finnish culture. And I feel like it still is, but it's almost like it's probably transformed some where it's not as much of a spiritual thing. You know what I mean? It's just part of the culture, but it used to be an essential part of the spiritual landscape of the people of Finland.
I think it's still a secular sacred if there is something like that, in the sense that people have these kind of rules of like in how to behave in the sauna. Back in the day, I believe it was the only place you could feel really like a warm during the winter. So it must have been very, very liminal. And my friend who has been living at least, I think, a couple of years in a Finnish cottage, so like a summer cottage with electricity but no wired heating. He said that the temperatures in Celsius were around maybe 10 Celsius during the winter plus, and it's quite cold if you think that in modern apartment they probably have maybe 22 Celsius plus. And he said that when he finally got to the sauna, because he was living like a hermit and still is, he said that it was truly like a magical experience to be without clothes and having this much warmth, where you only get quite minimal warmth during the days in winter. And I have felt it too, because during very harsh winter, say 20 to 30 minus degrees Celsius, when you have spent time outside and freezing your ass off, and when you finally get to the sauna, it's the contrast is directly atavistic as it's liminal, as it's truly magical.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you think about like that feeling like when you've been cold all day and it's freezing, you get in that sauna and you can be naked and you're sweating and you feel good. I do think it does create that liminal state because you also probably you're also a lot of times doing things like going between this warmth to the cold and back in warmth and all this kind of stuff. And I think it really it's a place set aside, if that makes sense. Like, it's a place
Yes.
that's outside of, if you really think about it in a direct way, it's a place that's so far outside of the outside world that, the outside is 10 degrees, 5 degrees Celsius, right? Like you're inside a place that's now like 30 degrees,
Yeah.
not more. And it's like you're like stepped into something outside of the world in so many ways. So it makes a lot of sense that it becomes this hallowed place that really and generates its own genus loci as well, which I think that the Finns probably carry around with them, even sometimes unknowingly, that they have this genus loci of the sauna. You know what I mean?
Yes, I think I know. And I have been using this, the pit sauna, like I used to call it, for I'm now like 46 years old. And I think I have been using this sauna for as long as I can remember, say probably 40 years now, because this is my family cottage, obviously. So during the last maybe 8 years, I have used this kind of ritual place. And I have this mask of the pit. This is some wooden, weird looking wooden mask I have bought from the local flea market because it directly spoke to me. And I have used it in rituals in the sauna in the sense that, I have had candles and this kind of light which works with batteries, which has an algorithm on it. It's like a smart light which can emit this kind of like a candle or candlelight. So it's organic looking along with the candles, and switch off the light so it's quite dark, in the sauna. And I had some ambient music, for example, on in a speaker which is hidden from sight. So basically, it's when you are a bit drunk, perhaps, and you have been in the sauna for an hour by yourself, and it really gets into some kind of temple in the sense that there's the mist, and then there is this ambient music, which is also like a liminal force multiplier, so to speak, and the mask and whatnot. And you really can detach from anything resembling contemporary
Yeah.
and secular that way.
Well, if you think about, there's a lot of people who swear by doing evocations, for example, with like huge amounts of incense smoke. You know,
Yeah.
where an entity could kind of form in the smoke. You could probably do something like that in a sauna, like get it super super misty and do some type of evocation in a sauna like that. And it could probably be a very effective method.
Yes, I think that anything which brings the liminal closer to you is beneficial to any kind of like a magical working. And on the contrary, anything secular and contemporary, say cell phones and internet and that kind of stuff, that kind of high tech electrical equipment really ruined the mood, so to speak. So I think also being alone most of the time is a good thing for practicing magic of any kind, in the sense that if you have like a good company of people who are really know what to do and they're really of the same ilk, then it might work. But I think a surefire way is to be somewhere alone, somewhere very liminal, and kind of to be maybe to evoke the liminal
Yeah.
directly.
I think it's probably easier alone. I mean, I'm not really experienced with trying to do magic with other people, personally, because to be honest, there's very few people I would feel comfortable doing magic with. I feel like
Yes.
I feel like I would be a lot more comfortable if I was doing something with just a girlfriend or something, right? Like some type of sex magic or something like that. But outside of that, I feel like it's much easier to just be by yourself, do your own thing. You'd have to be really, like you said, it'd have to be really like on the same level, or it would have to be a very different type of working. Like I think a working with a group would be something more like doing a black mass, or like you're doing like a kind of more public, like a ritual that is designed to be for a group that's not really necessarily a truly liminal type of working. You know what I mean? I think a liminal working is usually better alone.
I think you're very right in the sense that some kind of group working should be like an operation, something which needs more people, you know. And I think because magic is so personal that it's most often better to be done by yourself in solitude, in the sense that I would even say that if you have any kind of other people with you, they kind of unwillingly might act as some kind of consensus reality enforcers or beacons, if you catch my drift, in the sense that if the another persons who are probably in the environment are not 100% sure what they're doing, and they are not aligned with what you are trying to achieve, then they would act as some kind of
It's like a limiter.
sorry, come again.
It's like they act like a limiter, like it's like a limitation.
Limiter, yes, yes, that was what I was going after, and I have seen this with my like some maybe 30 years of expertise on this field, that some people can be like a negative magnet or something. They can really ruin the atmosphere, in the sense that if somebody is too timid or somebody is just being an idiot. So yes, I mean, like most of the work I have done at the pit has have been alone, and then there have only been like a select rituals which have involved other people. And I mean, like I have spent dozens and dozens and dozens of hours there myself, and that has always been the most powerful experience, because I think it also invokes this concept of the sacred horror, in the sense that whatever you experience by yourself, you have no like a backup. Nobody's going to save your ass when you are in confrontation with the liminal or the numinos or the mysterium tremendum aspect of things, and it can really soak you up.
Yeah, and I think that reaching that liminal stage of mind where often it's just a lot easier to achieve when you're by yourself because you're also not worried. I think a lot of times when we're interacting with other people, there is always going to be that like super ego quality, right? That or whatever that's looking at other people and is even unconsciously looking, worried about what other people think. So that's going to be a limiter as
Yes.
well because if you're particularly when you're engaging in certain types of liminal type of things, some of the stuff you might do might look kind of crazy to other people, right? And you might worry about that if there's other people around, unless there's a real true understanding built between you and the other person where you're not, which can be powerful, particularly there are people you meet that have a lot of like kind of personal magnetism and power that can help, I guess, energize certain types of workings, but I think that so there's always that potential of finding someone that works really well, but there has to be that kind of build up understanding where you're not worried about looking crazy or something like that.
Yes, and I think with humans and human interaction and the human games, the human power games, which is the worst of the lot, I think there's always masks involved. And when you are alone, there are no masks. I would at least hope so. And for example, I once invited two gentlemen to the pit. One was an like a chthonic artist, and the other guy was a photographer and a like kind of adventurer photographer, I might add. And I didn't even know these guys too well, but I had attended their mutual art exhibition a year before that. And I just had a good feeling that these guys know what I'm doing at the pit. And I invited them over, and we had a very, very interesting tour of the pit during the night. We explored every facet and every altar and every artifact of the place. And just afterwards, when we finished the meeting around 4 a.m., we were probably all quite tired, but we had a very in depth discussion and had a good time. And only afterwards, I understood that what the hell just happened. I invited the two people to the pit whom I didn't even know that well, and they resonated very well with everything I said, and there was no negative moments or something like that. And they apparently had a very interesting catabasis themselves. And then I just understood that there really are some very select and rare people who might be very well tuned of what you're doing. But then again, it's kind of something of a rarity, and I think one shouldn't be think or be like accustomed to it, because I think the contrary is more like a prevalent, because doing this kind of thing would have or could have ended in like a total disaster, in the sense that I would have been absolutely pissed off if I would invite somebody to the pit which is sacred to me, and if somebody would behave like an ass or something. So that wouldn't be good. But I think you know what I mean. But still, yet again, I think doing rituals only by yourself is even more powerful.
Yeah. Well, I think also like with that example you mentioned, you're also doing the thing of following intuition, right? Like
Yes, the diamond
yeah, sometimes it's good to
also.
follow that intuition where it's like you just have this, and and then that's also a bit of takes a bit of work, right? Some people think, oh, follow intuition just means do whatever I want. It's like, no, that's that's not what it is. There's like a feeling you get, and you have to learn how to distinguish that feeling. And once you learn how to distinguish that particular kind of feeling that's telling you this is what you should do, and you just do it, and you've trained yourself to act on that intuition, you're going to get a lot more experiences in life that can be a lot more satisfying, like what you're describing, because you, if you're always questioning your daemon and questioning your intuition and second guessing yourself, you're not going to have, you're going to close off the gates to your intuition. I feel like that's a very essential groundwork part of doing the magical initiation, is to reprogram your mind to open yourself up to intuition and to your daemon, because your daemon speaks through intuition. A lot of people say that. People like Michael Ford say that. It's Michael Kelly. Like pretty much anybody who's anybody who actually really understands the daemon knows that it primarily communicates through intuition.
I think these phenomena are somehow interconnected. Maybe the intuition has something to do with the brain framework and the deep mind. And then there is this layer of the diamond, which is something else. I think intuition alone cannot explain the concept of diamond, of course. And then everybody who has have had this kind of long lasting and a deep relationship with their personal diamond understand that this is so. And I would really advise people to kind of connect more with their personal diamond, because I know at least one instance in my life where it directly probably saved my life, in the sense that you might get these hints like don't do this, don't do that, but maybe sometimes you can get like a roar that don't fucking do that. It's like yelling at you, and you would be a total idiot to not comply.
Yeah, it's like this things where people get a bad feeling about to getting on an airplane, and they don't, they don't get it. They
Yeah,
start
something like that.
yeah, and then the airplane crashes. This is something that happens, in real life, and we've all probably
Yeah.
had experiences where like I've had this experience before where I'm just driving, where I drive down the road and I get this feeling like take this other way, like very strong, like to take a different way than I usually take. And I do that, and then I find out later on there was a horrible crash, like literally like 2 seconds after where I was. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
probably I would have been caught up in, but because I had this weird feeling to take a whole different way, I did. So those are some of the like real practical methods of I guess of how this operates, but so yeah, it does save your life in that way as well.
Yeah, it's uncanny, and I have lots of examples of how unstatistical the diamond has acted in unstatistical ways, and the insights and whatnot. This is a subject we have talked a lot about in the Mycelium signal, but I think this is a new facet to all of this, the interconnectedness of the intuition and the diamond. So let's delve a bit about your personal journey. How did you first get involved with the black mud of occultism and esoteric arts? Was there a particular event or influence that sparked this deep interest?
Well, I suppose it's always been kind of a little bit there throughout my whole life. I've always been fascinated by horror and the darker side of things from a very young age. I remember watching Universal horror movies at probably like 5 years old. My dad showing those to me, and then seeing a bunch of horror movies after that, like Nightmare on Elm Street and Alien and all that kind of stuff. I was just I was pretty obsessed with horror and the dark side of things, and the Fantasia, the the Night and Bald Mountain section with like the Chernobog, and that was a real big thing for me when I was a little kid. So I think that there was always this kind of like fascination with the dark side of things, and really drawn to all that kind of stuff. Or even as I got older, drawn to like dark noir and dark fantasy and yeah, and horror. Yeah, horror is one of those things that's been a lifetime thing. And then like on the spiritual side, I've always been very fascinated by spirituality and philosophy. When I was in my adolescent teenage years, my mother converted to Catholicism and she was trying to convert me, but my father was into like Sufism and Zen Buddhism primarily. So but he was kind of like had everything, like books about different world religions, and we had the Quran and the Torah and all that kind of stuff. So you could read everything, whatever. And not very. He wasn't. He was kind of anti-Christian in a lot of ways, anti-Catholic and stuff. But um, in particular, which probably comes from growing up in New England, But
Yeah,
um, but yeah, so he went towards those types. So I was kind of I kind of learned a lot about like Zen Buddhism and did a lot of meditation. I also did Aikido when I was a teenager, right, and a kid, for almost 10 years. And so I did like martial arts and was really into like Zen Buddhism that type of spirituality. But underlying that, I was also kind of fascinated by paganism and and I was also reading a lot of philosophy like Nietzsche and all that kind of stuff. And so had a lot of things, going on. And I was always attracted to the darker side of art, darker side of music, 100%. Like that was like my primary thing that I was into, was the darker side of stuff. So always searching for the darker things. And it was kind of like I was about to go on that trip to Norway and Sweden in 2004, when I would have been turning 17 that year. And I remember a few years before, I had kind of stumbled upon black metal and was kind of planted like a seed. I was like, that then grew. And I was about to go on a trip. I kind of was like, oh, I remember these like Norwegian bands and Swedish bands and stuff that burn churches and did all this crazy shit. And I think just being a little bit older, I was a lot more like, yeah, let's check this shit out. And because I was already into metal, and other stuff like experimental and noise and industrial and dark. I was listening to everything pretty much, but I hadn't really dived into too deep into black and death metal. And so I started diving into black metal as I was going on this trip. And part of what happened too is I remember I was doing this thing where I'll write, and then I would get into like kind of like a meditative state, basically, where it's almost like an imaginal level, and you're like kind of like just free form writing. This is something I did a lot when I was a teenager. And I remember being in this kind of imaginal state in my mind. Um, and there was this dark forest, a grove almost of like birch trees of some firs, kind of very, very much like some of the forests you have up there. But it was like dark, there was misty, and there was this hooded figure. He's turned away from me, and all of a sudden he turned towards me, and his eye like pierced me, and I had this kind of weird like awakening experience, if that makes sense. Which I see as like
yeah,
Wodan awakening within, you know what I mean? And that really set everything off. Between getting into black metal and that experience, I really went whole hog into we already had runes and stuff, so I went whole hog into like runic magic and bought like the Satanic Bible and was reading, just when like black metal really helped inspire going down this kind of atavistic, antinomian path of spirituality, where you really push yourself to explore anything. Like nothing is forbidden. Like you go like you really have to triumph over this kind of like good and evil bullshit that we have been programmed in our minds. I feel like that's an important part of black metal.
Dualistic, yeah.
You know, like black metal is not about like it's about really going beyond those types of things. I think that's a very Nietzschean idea of beyond good and evil within black metal. That's why so much black metal explores like topics that a lot of people find distasteful, and I think that's because it's if you're truly into black metal, you learn to not really have an emotional reaction, that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like, and that's you can even look at that with a lot of stuff. You look at a lot of people's reactions to Euronymous getting murdered. Just go, oh, well, that happened. Like it's like this part of black metal. That it's not about having these emotional reactions and acting like a human being. You know, and so I
Yeah,
found I found, I found the
yeah.
experience of getting into
Just
black
go on.
metal very like very much antinomian and very much breaking down a lot of this kind of stuff and opening a lot of doors to this whole other world of spirituality, which actually ended up being very very useful. That I had been doing Aikido, working with the kind of key energy, doing like Zen Buddhism. Like I was very very strong in meditation and and already doing basically I realized I was already doing my own form of magic naturally, right? And so uh yeah, it was just really it just kind of led down that path.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting. Many interesting points you just made. One thing I could pinpoint it was the subject or the theme of antinomianism, in the sense that most of our listeners probably know about this concept, but how would you define antinomianism? It would be easier for people to just confirm, be part of the so-called proverbial herd. But I think to be antinomian, it's really like challenging yourself and your beliefs and your notion of even reality. And but what drives people like you and me to this kind of path, which is not easy. And I'm not bragging here. I rightly mean, and I feel that sometimes that I would have had a very much easier life without this kind of trait, which I think it's not optional. It's somehow mandatory or something I can't just be without, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, I think
It's
it's
inherited.
yeah, I think it's part of the individual, in so many ways. I think I've always kind of had that. I've always had the element. It was getting into black metal brought it out in full force, but I was always very much an antinomian type of person who's always questioning things. That's why I would never get convinced to convert to Catholicism, because my mother tried to do it through like these conversations with me about theology and stuff, and I was always able to break holes through it that just didn't make sense to me.
Yes.
I was just like, I liked going to the churches, and I liked the music and the masses and incense and stuff. But that was about, I liked it as a sensual experience in the same way like surrealists did, like Patau or somebody, right? But I was just very antinomian. I'm very much an antinomian person where I go against the grain as often. Not. I guess there are people who are more like where they try to push things. Like if you think about like I don't know, somebody like Chuck Schuldiner from Death, like where he decided to start wearing pink shirts and talk about his musically life metal or all that kind of bullshit. I'm not
Yeah.
quite that far, where you're like to start like completely just fucking talking shit about the things that you're involved in. But I think that just antinomian in the sense that and against the culture itself, the restrictions. I think that antinomian spirituality is very much about liberation and freedom, and there's a destructive side to it as well. It tears things down, like it tears down barriers, it tears down walls to other things. It looks at stuff and sees sees the stupidity and a lot of things that people do, right? Like, and you do have to be careful. Like, you can have too much iconoclasm, and you can that can lead you down the pathway of Mao or something, right? But I think you have to have a certain respect for things, but they have to be true things. I think that true antinomian spirituality
Yeah.
isn't just pure destruction, which some people see it as. I think that it's more like it can definitely become something where you're destroying certain things.
Yeah, I think true antinomianism is not itchy, and it's not like a cheap provocation at all. And I think you should direct your antinomianism firstly to yourself and to challenge your beliefs and stances and that kind of stuff, and of course to authorities too. But I'm sure that it's not puerile rebellion. Or at least, of course, everybody has been like rebellious in their teens, and it's something you have to go through. But you should not be stuck in there. You should be like open-minded still to
Yeah,
things.
I think you're 100% right. It's primarily an antinomianism is primarily directed at yourself. It's directed at the spiritual and societal strictures that
Yes.
restrain you. You know what I mean? Like a subconscious and conscious level. So it kind of comes down to like I said, going beyond good and evil in so many ways. Like completely a revaluation of all values is an antinomian act because you're telling yourself, okay, what is good and what is evil? Is what these people are saying good actually good? Can you look at
Yeah.
the Bible and see it from Satan's viewpoint? And then when you suddenly do that, then it breaks down the entire meaning of that thing. Now you no longer see God as some type of like higher being. He's just a petty like tyrant. Like you
Yeah.
see, it changes everything. That's why people are afraid of it because it can fundamentally change your worldview so much that you see everything through a whole different lens.
I think it's akin to psychedelics in the sense that there probably is before having a psychedelic experience and afterwards. It's you can't compare the two. And I think also the straight jacket of the consensus reality, that is, as a magician of any kind, I think that is the first thing you should break out from, and it would involve some kind of taboo breaking, of course. And it's an age-old tradition, this antinomianism. But I just think it goes much further than people would think it does. I think any kind of, say, the aforementioned psychedelic experience or something would create a complete breakdown with somebody who is too invested in the any kind of religion. And I think even this consensus reality is actually secular religion. And one of my interviewers before said that it's a sucker punch, it's a mind trick, and it is something which is given. And I think normal people don't even understand how to question things. And I think if you are truly a philosopher or have this kind of tendencies to be inquisitive, you should really think hard about any kind of historical given narrative or whatever. And I'm not speaking about conspiracy theories here, but I mean really think that is my build of the reality, is it fireproof? Does it withstand true pressure? For example, very popular scientific viewpoint, which kind of maybe thinks science as a like a religion which has all the answers, that can be very easily broke down. For example, there would be somebody who would be a very diehard skeptic and materialist, reductionistic, whatever type of person, and this kind of viewpoint can work only in the so-called safe space of scientism, which is consensus reality. But if you would take this person into like a basement and keep him there for 2 weeks without any light or sensory inputs or whatever, fucking feed him psychedelics, and what would return? And this is of course a thought experiment, mind you. And what would emerge from there wouldn't be the same person anymore, because his understanding and grasp of reality would be totally shattered. And this is not even something to make fun of. I really believe that our realities, like personal given realities, are not so set in stone that we would like them to be. So I think this is something just to keep in mind when you're delving with the occult and the esoteric and this kind of liminal antinomian stuff.
One thing that drives me crazy nowadays is when you're dealing with so-called skeptics. And a real
Yes.
skeptic is somebody who is open to the idea of something actually being true, but who's just like wants to make sure he's not being hoodwinked. Like
Yes.
a true skeptic will be like, "Oh, like this looks like something. This is something that I can't explain. This is crazy," like. But is like skeptical if he sees like some footage that looks like it's obviously been doctored, you know. But nowadays, the skeptic thing has been co-opted by this kind of atheistic, like scientist type
Yeah.
of movement. And I think it's been like this for a long time, but where they're like, a skeptic is somebody who like basically just tries to question away, basically tries to rationalize everything, say everything's something else. Like even if he sees stuff in front of him, he's gonna like just like claim that something else. And I mean, this goes back to a long time ago. I mean, if you think about the 1800s, if you ever read like The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood,
Yeah.
one of the main characters in that story is a doctor who is doing that, and you almost get the feeling that he's knowingly doing that to try to protect his own sanity. Like he can't really and try to protect everyone else's sanity. You know what I mean? Like so, he's like purposely like saying that, oh no, it's just this, it's just that. Like, but he can see what's going on.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's been going a long time. I mean, a lot of authors like Blackwood and Mockin and these people have been kind of mocking some of the skeptics because of that reason. But it does go two ways. You have people who are way too accepting of everything they see, and they go, oh, everything's, as when people would think everything's haunted or whatever. But like, I think it's better to be that way because at least the world's magical. If you're the other way, then you think you're grounding yourself in reality, but reality is that you're also just like cutting yourself off from experience.
Yeah, it's like limiting and like I think he was an American author or some kind of researcher coined the term nothing butterism. So love is nothing but, and life and the spirit or whatever human experience is nothing but something. And I think it's completely like beside the point and quite obnoxious even to claim. I mean, if we have figured out some mechanics of how human brains work, I believe the problem or the question of consciousness is not nowhere near solved. And it's like this Pinocchio theory by this American author Scott Baker. He has this terrible book, Neuropath, like psychopath but neuropath, and it has this villain who is some kind of like a neurosurgeon, and he is kind of the ultimate nihilistic determinist, and he has this Pinocchio theory, which is probably the most nihilistic and the most debilitating and grim take on the determinism. You probably catch my drift. So I think even though the determinism aspect or this kind of Big Bang theory in the sense that everything we are doing is just Pinocchio doing some echoes from the Big Bang. So it's like everything is doomed. We are just automatons going through some pre-scripted play. I think even if that might be true, it's still good effort to just fight back.
Yeah, when you think about like, imagine having that actual worldview, because that's kind of a worldview that somebody like Gotti uses as a horror point. You know what I mean? Like horror, like somebody like Gotti saying like, wouldn't it be horrific if we're just mannequins, puppets?
Yeah,
Like we're not, nothing means everything. I think a lot of people miss actually. I almost don't think that Ligotti really believes the things he says in like Conspiracy Against Human Life. I think he's presenting a spirituality, or not spirituality, but a philosophy and stuff that underlines the horror of his work. If that makes sense. Like that's
yeah,
like the philosophical and spiritual quality of his horror, is his pessimism. Whether or not he actually believes that is I find very doubtful because a lot of people who know him don't seem to think that he seems kind of the opposite, right? In so many ways. But I think that there might be a part of us that can connect that kind of like real pessimistic. I mean, I definitely have felt that sometimes where you just feel this kind of pessimism about everything. But I don't think that we're just, I don't actually think that we're just mannequins like in an insane world. You know what I mean? Like necessarily. I think that, but I do also think that even if that's true, that doesn't really matter because I do kind of believe in the existential idea that reality is a kind of void, and the only real meaning of reality is what we give to it in so many
Yeah.
ways. On one level, I can say that I have my own beliefs about a lot of things, but I can't say on an objective level that I really believe that it's really hard to argue against the idea that we can make our own sense of worth, that we make our own reality, that when we turn on that kind of existentialist idea that actually we just need to make that point where you actually just choose to live, say yes to life, as Nietzsche would say.
Yes,
um,
I think that's a
even
good point.
even in the face of possible nihilism, even at the face of maybe possibly nothing means anything. But does that really matter? You have to look at the absolute void of the real, the absolute depths um of all this stuff, and then turn your back, and instead of killing yourself, you say yes to life, and you go, even if that's true, I believe that there is meaning and there is, inexperience in life, in the life that I live in of itself, and it doesn't really matter what happens in the long run. We just have to, you know, you have to, I guess, like re-submerge yourself in the world of forms, like Klages would talk about, in so many ways, that's actually the real form of living a real life is this kind of, I guess, you can go to like a kind of Empyrean level where you see the meaninglessness of everything, but then you have to, which I think kind of puts yourself in that Negretto phase, but then you have to submerge into the physical, into the body, and back into the chthonic, and that's really where you find like the guts of why of being alive. Really, I mean, for me personally, I guess that, some people might find a lot more thing valuable time it's just sitting in a fucking place meditating all the time. But I turned away from that when I was a teenager. When I turned away from Buddhism because I thought it was kind of stupid. To just sit in a fucking place. I mean, I get it if you're old, like let's say you get to like, 70, 80 years old and you're like, okay, I'm ready to retire from life and just go meditate in the cabin or something. That's cool.
Yeah,
But I'm not really I believe that we should be part of life and part of the world and
active.
active in the world, and for me that's my path. I'm somebody who has always felt that need to be part of the world, and um even though I do feel like there is an inherent kind of meaninglessness to it, I don't really worry about that much.
Yeah, I think the meaninglessness aspect, the void before the true void after death, of course, I think it can coexist with the meaning we make, and perhaps some kind of perennial meaning. And if I would have been totally nihilistic, I would have never dug up the pit and have this experience here, which has been one of the most great in my magical and initiatory life thus far. And it's I think Peter Wessel Zapfe, who was a Norwegian philosopher, who was I think he was a big influence on Thomas Ligotti. It's also influenced me. But Zapfe said something like, when you're faced with this crippling existential anxiety and meaninglessness, and there are a couple of ways which you can deal with that. And the first ways were something like just put your head in the sand like an ostrich, or the best term to cope with that was the sublimation, to turn the misery and the existential angst into art, and maybe some kind of like a magical project.
Yeah, I think that in my experience, like when I really full on went into this Negretto stage to really confront the demon, all these demons of sort of say all the void, the real, like all this stuff. I found that one of the most powerful things was reading Albert Camus, the myth of Sisyphus, and how
Oh,
he's talking about the heroic path of saying yes to the myth of Sisyphus. You know, like when you confront the desert of the absurd, as Camus talks about, right? Then you have two choices. You can either kill yourself, or like he says, like Zappa says, he talks about you can try to turn back and just put your head in the sand, but you're always going to come. You're always going to. It's going to erupt eventually.
yeah.
The absurd is going to erupt again, or it's I can't remember the exact word, but it's basically like an integration. It's just saying yes to the absurdity. You just live your life knowing that it's absurd and realizing that that it's okay. You know, you and I look at it like that way. It's like the void around us is the absurd, the real, as somebody like Lacan would say, would called it. You know, like I think that this thing, this true state of what is around us, what we're made of, all the stuff that you experience at the darkest depths of Negretto. I think that the only way to have the conjunctio to like kind of return, you know, um, and return to your body and really integrate. Yeah, it's an integration. It's a realization that this is the fact, that the absurd is there, the real is there, the void is around us and within us, and all this kind of stuff. But to just go, yeah, that's true. But you just integrate it into yourself. I think that's from, and I guess that kind of equivocates to subliminate in a way. It's a similar idea. Is you're integrating it, and now when you fully return to existence, they're not going to have that kind of real eruption of of the absurd, like somebody who's like just trying to put their head in the sand and pretend like they didn't see it. And I know that from my experience, because that's kind of after my first real true experience of the absurd, of the real. I did kind of do that. I did kind of try to. It was so almost scarring, like so powerful, of an experience that it really, like, it was very difficult for me to process on a human level, and I had to do a lot of research to be able to really deal with it. And so I actually turned and dealt with it on purpose as a magical working that ended up taking a couple years, really fully, at least a year, to really try to work my way through it. And alchemical language was the biggest thing that really helped me. Like I read almost everything that Jung ever wrote about alchemy and that process, and hermetic magic by Evola and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like the alchemical symbolism does really work. It's like this kind of perennial mystery within us that it just unlocks this stuff in our brains that helps us process through these types of spiritual states. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And yeah, like I said, myth of Sisyphus, I guess, was a real help me put it into context as well. You know, I think that that's an incredible book that I feel like a lot of occultists kind of overlook Camus, but I think that it's Camus a very powerful thinker. You know.
Yeah, this actually brings to my mind this kind of like an archetype of outsider or the perennial outsider. And I think most occultists are. And how would you define the difference between esotericism and the occultism, or the occultist or the esotericist? And I'm not trying to be sarcastic here, or do try to build any walls between, but I just think that how would you define someone who is of the so-called occultist archetype? What that kind of person really is? What drives people to the occultism instead of, for example, the more codified, or how would you say, more established, centuries long line of esotericism, if you catch my drift?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there is a kind of slight difference between the esotericist and the occultist in a lot of ways. Um, and I guess I kind of realized I fell more in the esotericist line of things. I kind of really started thinking about that a few years ago with Richard Gavin, actually, because he kind of refers to himself more as an esotericist, or he's into the esoteric, right? You know what I mean? Like, and I kind of get where he's coming from, because I do think that somebody who's involved with the occult, and is an occultist, um, is often they are interconnected. There's definitely, you can go back and forth between these two different categories in your lifetime, even, right?
Yes.
But I do think that the occult the occultist definitely can become something a little bit different than an esotericist, because I think an esotericist is somebody who's probably more on a mystical path in some ways. It's more of an initiatory path. It's a process of transformation of the self, and uh, I think you see a lot more people involved with like the liminal and stuff, kind of calling themselves more of an esotericist.
Yes.
You can talk about the esoteric, you know, um, is a little bit different. The occult is the hidden, right? And I do think that what you can see a lot of times, a negative of people getting too deeply involved with the occult, and I've seen this in friends. I've even had this happen to myself at times in my past, where you get kind of enraptured by the occult. You know what I mean? Like by just like it's almost like the surface of it. Like you're buying these occult books, and you get kind of enraptured by the occult for its own sake. And you forget that it's actually supposed to be, the symbols are supposed not symbols in and of themselves, but they're symbols that unlock secrets to the esoteric. You know what I mean? Like, um, but I do feel like the occultist can very often get caught up into the occult for its own sake, and um, and just basically chase their own tail. Essentially, they're just kind of like engaged with it, um, and they're not really getting anywhere. It's not really about their initiation or anything like that. It's just about engaging with the occult, and that's, in one way that's fine, but you do feel like it can become a trap in a way if you are more involved with the initiatory path of transformation of yourself. Uh, that the occult in of itself can become can be a temptation, which is of course part of the path of the left hand. The satanic path is a path of temptations, right? That you have to pass through, because you could get caught up in a certain stage of development. Basically, I feel like, because somebody who's involved with the occult for its own sake is going to be, if you ever seen the movie The Ninth Gate,
Yes.
and you have
Johnny Depp. Yeah.
the joined up, yeah, you have at the end where you have like that set, the rich people satanic ritual where they're all like dressed up in black robes, and then Franklin Joe breaks in. He's like talking like mumbo jumbo, like, look at you, a bunch of fools in fancy dress. The people in that kind of thing, I feel like, are people who are involved with the occult for its own sake, because it's fun, because they're gonna have some sex or whatever, and in a lot of ways, there's nothing wrong with that, really, right? But it is a stage of development, and that a lot of people get trapped in.
Okay, that's interesting. That actually wasn't what I was getting at, but I think you just managed to open how would you say, like a new topic in the Mycelium signal, in the sense that I don't think this aspect of the occultism hasn't talked that much before, and that those were very good points, and I agree, because, for example, you also see in the New Age scene, which I quite detest, something like this, that people are so into any kind of astral energies, man, and this kind of stuff. They don't even know what they're talking about, and it doesn't have any foundation. What I was getting at myself is that here in Finland we have a kind of a renaissance of the esoteric, in the sense that there have been academic studies and lots of books and new publishers of esotericism. I mean, like good, serious publishers of esoteric material in the Finland, and it's like something you might read from the national newspapers, and exhibitions have been like huge, so it's really on the rise in Finland. And of course, there's this esoteric studies master's program in Amsterdam's university, for example, and this kind of. I really think this is a good idea. After the stranglehold of the Christianity in Europe, and of course in the States too. This is a good thing, yes. But what I was getting at was that at getting at some kind of like a renegade archetypal occultist, in the sense that I think there are some people who are kind of like mavericks in the field of the esoteric or the occult. And I think there, of course, are risks involved, and some people just might turn fucking mad, either with the reason you just provided, or just that the psyche cannot take it anymore. And but I think there is merit to be kind of experimentalist and explorer, and kind of like old school scholar of anthropology. I mean, research of anthropology back in the day, when they used to get into the rituals themselves and not just do some internet research, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, and you have people like
That
Maya Deren become like fully involved with the voodoo cult and
yes,
stuff like that, right? Yeah. So
yes, and I might add too that I think I'm not trying to be too harsh here, but I think in the more mainstream kind of long running esoteric traditions, which are more easily acceptable, I think some people can negatively experience too little. I mean, if they are like being spoon fed. When it kind of in some, I'm not going to say any names of any group, but I think you get what I'm getting at, that they are basically going through the motions and getting spoon fed, instead of like doing their own personal boots on research. And of course, I'm speaking of myself here, that in the sense that I have always been some kind of maverick, in the sense that I have always liked to research things myself and take risks, and I have burned my fingers more than often.
I've always been that kind of person who's yeah, I've always been the type of person who researches for myself and learns for myself and follows my own type of beat of my own drum, so to say. And I do think that the true occultist, esotericist who's involved with personal transformation and is going to be a maverick type of person, like you're saying. I definitely think that definitely the magician as an archetype is somebody who is in very many ways self-sufficient in that sense, and is a person who is, you know, can also be the fool who's wandering off to the edge. He's going to jump off the edge, you know, and plunge himself into the next transformation, right? And uh so yeah, I do think that that is an essential part of the occultist slash esotericist, whatever you want to call, who is involved with true transformation of the self. You know, who's not just trying to like, you know, do some spells to do whatever, you know, like, you know, because there are people who just want to like, oh, I just want to do some spells and manifest stuff in my life, but it doesn't really work that way. You know what I mean? Like, you know, magic doesn't really work that way. You know, you can't just, you have to engage. I do believe that you have to engage with some type of spiritual transformation to even make the mundane magic work, you know. But as you're saying with I do think that culturally it's an interesting period right now, because we have, and this country is a very weird one where um evangelical Christianity is on the rise, for sure. Um, but then you also have on the same hand on the rise, like kind of like I call them Instagram witches, or like TikTok witches and stuff like
Yes.
that. You know what I mean? And which I think is just the new. It's basically like the Wicca people, but now they wear black, right? You know, it's the same type of. A lot of times when you talk to these people, they're still spouting off like a lot of the Wicca bullshit, and you know, I don't really care too much, because it doesn't really bother me. Like they can do whatever they want, but I do, you know, I do find it kind of funny. But I do think the good side of that is that it at least makes it easier, because we can still exist in a society, like, you know, we can exist in a society where I can basically buy occult books on whatever topic anytime I want right now. You know, I can just go on in this country, I can go on Miskatonic or Arcane Offerings, or like even Amazon, and find books about pretty much any type of occultism, esotericism, Satanism,
Yeah.
left hand path spirituality. You can find it's everything, and it's great. It's so much. It's awesome compared to the early 2000s when I started getting into this type of stuff, where we had about 5 books you could find that was even remotely dark. Like I remember, you buy like the Satanic Bible, and I bought like Constantinos Nocturnicon, and maybe like Liber Null Psychonaut by, and then you had what was that one, the Liber Koth and Liber Nox as well. You can primarily find like chaos magic stuff in that time period, late 90s, early 2000s,
Yeah.
or Wicca stuff, and that was about it. That was on the darker side of things. It was very difficult to find anything that was dark, really. And now it's very different. There's all kinds of antinomian spirituality literature, and people, and it's much easier to engage with other people involved with that because of the internet. Like, so there are benefits to this technology. That's one benefit of technology. The fact that we're even having this conversation is a benefit. But I think that So I think a lot of this stuff is good. I think the academic interest in esotericism is a mixed thing. I think they could be good. I think they could also be bad because I don't fully trust the current academic world as it is right now.
Yes.
Um, because it's a little too political and partisan. A lot of,
Biased.
you know,
Yeah.
and I think that can be a very negative thing when you're for the applying that to a spirituality or esotericism, occultism, all this stuff. I think that applying some type of political lens on this stuff can be very negative.
I agree, and it's like this kind of dualistic, cheap moralism. I mean, like this kind of dumb moralism, which doesn't really think things over, is not a good thing for magic and occultism, esotericism. And I think people just, like we discussed before, need to really think hard about this kind of good and bad aspect,
Yeah.
because it can really like trap you into this kind of safe space of the consensus reality, and it while it can make things easier, it's still a fucking straitjacket. And I think one would do good to really exercise some kind of like an internal transgression or antinomianism. I think at the key of that is, like you said before, the liberation of this kind of any kind of fetters. And it's like sometimes you can be your worst enemy yourself. You might be so stuck up in your own head. And I would advise that people think long and hard that or kind of like examine themselves for not to be a puppet in somebody else's game. And I mean, it's quite evident that there's lots of propaganda going, and disinformation and whatnot. And I'm not even going into any kind of like a conspiracy theory territory here, but it's just evident that there are players, and then there is a game, and you wouldn't want to be a part of somebody else's game. And
Yeah.
I'll just leave people to think what I mean with that.
The one
Yeah.
thing I'll say about what we're talking about, though, about academic research into, I do think the benefit of applying a neutral academic viewpoint upon occultism, esotericism can be beneficial if you think about, like, my friend Shea Boulet with his book about Friedrich Nietzsche and Satanism. He applies a very academic type of viewpoint because I do believe it came out of his master's degree work, I think. But I think that sometimes applying that sober clarity to the work and putting that research angle and all that kind of stuff can be very useful. I also look at something like I recently have been reading Shawnee Oates books, like their Devil's Supper and her books about Odin, like, and they're very well researched. They have they're not necessarily academic; they're kind of pseudo academic, but they do draw on academic research. Um, and I do think that when you take this kind of like clear neutral academic, just using the method, right? And then you marry that with somebody who's actually an esotericist who has a spiritual intuition and conversation with their daemon, it can be a very powerful combination. So that's one thing I did want to mention when it comes to that kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Yes, I think this kind of like an open-mindedness that somebody would have an actual academic research, like back things up and still be kind of like a maverick liminal occultist is a good idea to marry these two together, because it's like most often people are just one of the other. They are like strictly academic, or then they are just completely mad, mad like a scientist occultist.
You can even go back to Stephen Flowers, aka Edward Dorson, like his work. He's one of the first people who really popular this idea of basing your work in academic realities, but then applying the kind of demonic intuition and inspiration to it as well, and I don't know. I do think that is important, because it does separate, because you do see some people who write certain types of cult books that are just full of nonsense, and they haven't
Yes,
done any research,
definitely.
like, and it's one thing if you're writing an inspired text that's going to have encoded spiritual things in it. That's totally different, if you're writing something out of inspiration, as not you're not trying to put any kind of objective reality into it. But if you are writing a book that's got to have like some objective reality angles in it, you got to make sure that it's like grounded in reality and not just spouting off a bunch of horseshit.
Yes, this kind of psyche bubble,
Yeah.
which is quite like ripe, or like it's quite yeah. You stumble upon that a lot in modern occultism, in the sense that it's like the amount of grimoires in the world, in the open market, is it's just staggering. But anyhow, it's like everybody should do what is best for themselves. But this is just my and your stance on this subject, of course. And
Yeah.
I believe in open-mindedness and liberation, to put it bluntly. Would you have some more critique against contemporary occultism, or do you think that that suffice?
I think that suffice. I mean, unless you want
Yeah,
to.
I think we we criticized it enough. In the Tonenportti collective, which the Mycelium Signal podcast is part of, we have this term anomalies, or the anomaly. To just give the listeners some idea, anomaly would be something like very strong synchronicity, for perhaps, and more like something which would normally be thought to be some kind of suprarational or even like a paranormal occurrence. Let me tell you something of my own, which happened in this sauna cabin. This is like something which is along the lines of like unexplained phenomenon. Probably I was here like last autumn, I think, and it was quite dark outside and it was late. And I don't know what I was doing here and the sauna cabin, but I was kind of closing things up, wrapping up my mobile studio or something. And I believe I had some music playing on, some kind of like a ritual ambient or something. And then I suddenly, without any kind of warning, heard this kind of abrupt, very sharp and short scream. And it really startled me. It was like it was something which happened so suddenly and without any kind of like a logical explanation, that it really like almost poured some like a cold water on top of my head, if you catch the expression. And then with strong, absolutely strong cold shivers, I went outside, and afterwards I listened to the track again and thought that maybe this was some kind of like a prank with with ambient music or something like part of it, but it wasn't. And to this date, I have no idea what the fuck that was, but it was completely uncanny. And of course, this is a like a how would you say, mild anomaly when compared to what some people have had. But these things apparently happen to people from sometimes. And I'm not trying to play some ghost hunters here or something, but I'm speaking about the very real weird things which might happen to people without any kind of natural or logical explanation. So if you would care to share that, if you have had something like this happen to yourself too in the realm of the occult.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely think these types of things can happen. I think I think about like the ironic thing is I haven't had that happen very often. Like when you're in ritual itself, if you're doing magic or I know some people if they do invocations, evocation, things like that, they'll have like weird knocks and stuff like that happen. But I never really had that experience like in ritual, but it'll be often afterwards or at night, or like when you're trying to sleep. Um, I've had like those types of like weird night experiences. Like I remember um having like those like night terrors where you suddenly like I remember having this dream, this thing sitting on you, and I remember feeling that night terror feeling. I was coming out of sleep and having that kind of like horrible night terror feeling. And then all of a sudden I heard I like, I kind of asserted my will like get the fuck away from me. I heard this like don 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 sound, like literally like in my room towards the window as if it was like running away. And then I could get up. You know what I mean? Um so I've had those types of experiences. I've had like straight up like seemingly haunted, like one of my old apartments I believe was truly haunted. And I think it was feeding on my ex at the time, but I had like really crazy things happening there with like straight up stuff like that. That was the experience that really taught me that this was like I was probably like I believe 21, 22, no 22 at the time, and I was definitely a believer in like the spiritual world and ghosts and stuff like that in a lot of ways. But I was more like that kind of like I thought that something was there, that there's some type of thing going on. Um, a true skeptic in the sense that I was still in that, I was willing to change my mind on what the thing is based just off of experience and what made sense to me, like, and I'd had a few strange experiences up to that point. Um, I remember even earlier than that, wasn't a full on paranormal experience, but I remember I went out into the woods and I had this like really deep, like kind of like weird, like spiritual experience there. And I came back and it was a very weird, creepy forest I was at. I came back and I made this like 4 or 5 song. I literally recorded this 4 song, I think it was demo that was done like this really raw way, like very like primal. And it was very much inspired by this weird, creepy forest I was at. And when I got done, it started becoming night. And I remember feeling like this sense of dread at a certain point that like something was looking at me through the window, but there was nothing there. It got so bad to the point that I had to close the drape. I didn't go out to smoke or anything. Like, and I actually waited till basically the sun started coming up to be able to go to sleep because I just felt like there was something floating around outside trying to get in. So I've had that kind of feeling before, which I think they were connected. Somebody I was talking to about it was like, well, it's probably something unhuman from the forest followed you, which I think probably happened. Because that was a very intuition feeling. But when I finally had something like straight up affect material reality, that really changed my viewpoint, broke everything open, which is a very anomalous type of experience of like, you know, bathtub turning on by itself. And then I think the creepiest thing that happened to me with that, which is most unexplained thing, was uh all of a sudden we pulled back the shower curtain because the shower curtain protecting the back wall as well. It was a very old building. It was from the Civil War era here in this country, so the 1860s. And it had like a tub where you had to have two curtains. I pulled the curtain aside on the back, and there was these claw like black, viscous, oily claw marks on the wall, as if somebody had been trying to claw out of the bathtub or something. You know what I mean? And left these like streaks on the wall. And if you tried to wipe it away, it would just come back again. And it was like a weird texture. When I told the story on the episode of Richard Gavin, uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
I remember that.
yeah, he was like, "Oh, it sound, we're talking about." It basically it seemed like it was ectoplasm, like literally, because it would just come out of the wall. And as the activity in that place got worse and worse and worse, more and more of this shit started coming out of the walls. And it was the weirdest substance. Like it looked kind of like oil, but you'd like touch it and it would like absorb into your body. You know. Um,
Oh,
yeah, like it would just disappear. It would be like it was as if it was like, yeah, some type of it was weird, dude. Um, and then once the activity started subsiding, once I finally got, because I think it was feeding on my ex, and then once I kind of got her to stop being quiet as afraid, it did subside. It was still there, like you could feel this thing and hovering over you, like you still hear scratches on the walls and all this type of stuff, like the whole time I lived there. But and the finger marks on the back were they never went away. But the liquid coming out of the rest of the bathroom started like not coming out as much, or went away as it went down, right? It's very weird. And that whole experience really broke open reality to me, because I was like, there's more to reality than what we think. I mean, I already had this type of thought process through my own experiences of spirituality and an idea of key and all this type of stuff that I'd experienced in my life. But that told me that there are other things out there for real. You know what I mean? Like there's things that we can't see with our basic sight generally. Sometimes we do, though. I do think that we can. I do think there are places that have these intense liminal energies where that shit crosses over. I think that our ancestors probably saw things like ghosts and spirits and demons and stuff a lot more than we do now. Because I do think the liminal, it's not just it is a place, but it's also ourselves. We can become a liminal place.
like a conduit
Yeah.
for the liminal. Yeah,
Yeah.
I also think that, like, I think it was Richard Gavin who said himself that when the liminal seeps into the everyday life or the everyday consensus reality world, then it's really like it's really electrifying. And I have said this before, and I said it again. It's like when an individual who is like allegedly sane, not suffering from any kind of psychosis which creates hallucinations and that kind of stuff, experiences these kind of anomalies. He's kind of like orphaned in the sense that he's left with his own devices, in the sense that the consensus reality doesn't acknowledge this kind of phenomenon, but yet they seem to happen. And I have heard from quite many credible sources of quite, how would you say, explicit even this kind of anomalous phenomenon. And I find it interesting that in some cases, in some houses, there are some like anomalies which seems to defy the laws of physics. For example, the doors opening by themselves, the more often like some object moving in invisible. uh, I mean, they are like visibly moving without any kind of external motor, so to speak. And I think this idea of the haunted house as a genius loci. I think you touched upon this subject with Nas in his latest appearance in your podcast. Did you
Yeah.
not?
Yeah.
Salem Slot, for example, the Stephen King's book and the movie.
Yeah. That's the
Yeah,
yeah, episode that should be coming out here soon for everybody. And yeah, um, the upcoming episode with Nas. Yeah, we talked about a little bit about that, so people can look forward to that. But I think that something which Nas and I also kind of talked about in that episode that people probably won't have heard by the time this one's out is that the idea that um an object, you can basically, and objects and things can be really like uh can have like a true numinous quality implanted on them. As I've gotten older, I've really learned that and realized that you can really saturate an object with this kind of magical force, right? And and it can become the sacred object that really ties into the numinous. In the past, I used to think of it more of a, like when you're doing magic, like that certain things, a ritual magic, that certain things are more like a psychological thing, that they help us just tap into that psychological state faster or something. Like it becomes like a trigger, that helps us drop into that meditative state faster. But I started to realize that these objects can also gain their own numinous power. So I almost think that, why couldn't a house? Why couldn't a place? A place.
Yes.
I've been in. I do believe in places of power in the forest. Like if you really drop
Yes.
your consciousness down and just wander through the forest, you'll find these power spots. The forest will take you to them, and I think that, I believe in feng shui and the idea of like the dragon lines 100%, like the ley lines. And I think that certain places just have more power than others. And I think that, um, and places can, can gain this power too through things happening. And that's why I do really believe in the idea of the haunted house, because I do think that places that have a lot of things happening can become haunted, and it's even more so if there's other factors that, you know um and I think that I do think that a lot of materialist people will have supernatural experiences, but or these types of anomalous experiences, and we'll just write it off, and because
Yeah, dismiss.
they have a really strong ability to filter out things that don't make sense to them, right? So,
Yeah.
and I mean, I remember reading Michelle, the kind of psychic spiritualist person, Michelle Bellinger, has a book about her spiritual experiences, like kind of awakening to her kind of stuff, and she talked about her stepdad being that way. Like something would be literally happening like in the same room and everyone else would see it, but he would just like be like filtering it out and not, just like there'd be weird stuff happening all the time and he would just like filter it out. And that happens to a lot of people. So I do think that one part of all this, having these anomalous experiences, if you do really have that to the point that it erupts, to the point that it breaks down these barriers, then you really have to look at the world in a totally different way. Then what that does at the same time is it also, I think, really helps to re-enchant the world in a lot of ways, because I think a haunted world is an enchanted world. It's a world
It's
of
alive.
mystery. It's alive. It's an animist world. It's a world where every every place you go has a spirit and a genus loci, and it's a world of forms and what lies beyond the forms, and it's just a much more beautiful place to live, I think, than a world of dead matter where nothing really means anything. You know what I mean? And I do think it's more realistic too, that the world is alive around us, and a lot of quantum mechanics can even prove that. And a lot of science is now realizing that things are really, like, trees talk to each other, like
Yeah.
animals have this kind
Mushrooms and
of extra levels of
mycelium.
yeah, not even just mushrooms, but even trees, they talk to each other as well. And um there seems to be some type of communication through plants, and yeah, and like you said, like mushrooms and everything. And animals have extra levels of consciousness that we're only now like truly starting to understand. Like, I think that science is going to eventually break down the whole materialist idea in of itself, because I think that the separation of the two was a kind of demiurgic process of attempting to control us. You know what I mean?
I really think it was a mistake, and I have this new, like a refined take on this matter. I think maybe when did the so-called scientific, like, enlightenment begin? I mean, like, it's quite recent in the sense that most of the time, mankind, has suffered from nature, and nature has been like a beast to mankind. and we have lived in constant suffering and horror from nature. And now that we have got this kind of upper hand with nature, it seems like mankind is doing some kind of collective retribution or some kind of revenge on the nature. And I think this is quite understandable, this advent of consensus reality and scientism in this regard. But I think still it is a mistake. It is something which has already should be passed, and to give a like more holistic approach on things, it would be a very good idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think that even though we were subject to the horror of nature for so long, I do think that at the same time we had a more holistic viewpoint. The world was a
Yeah,
living world around us, even in the Middle Ages, um, and the kind of enlightenment sniffiness that superstition and all this kinds of stuff and belief that they is kind of like and it's funny because I do believe in certain enlightenment ideas. I believe that the enlightenment is useful for certain aspects of life, like the political structures. A lot of the enlightenment era ideas about political structures I think are still very valid. Ideas of liberty, freedom, equality for all, all this kinds of stuff. People being able, John Stuart Mills and this types of ideas of people being allowed to live in their own life as long as it's not hurting other people, all this kind of stuff. But I think when enlightenment values are taken on to some other aspects of reality, it becomes very much a restricting,
yeah,
blinder type of mindset. And you can see that. And of course, like I guess I've always been more attracted to the romantics and then the decadence, like that's more of my speed of things, which is almost an eruption against the Enlightenment. If you think about Byron and Shelley and Shelley, Percy
got it.
Shelley was obviously he had some Enlightenment aspects to him because he was very much an atavistic, Prometheus Unbound. He had these types of things that were somewhat similar to Enlightenment, but then he's also very much about the intuition and all this kind of stuff. So I think, um, but I'm just more of a William Blake and the Romantics and those the whole Gothic and literature and decadent literature and the kind of like anti-enlightenment, anti kind of like when you get it later in the 1800s, you had like the Victorian era where people really had this like that's when the myth of progress really started and people had this kind of kind of like ridiculous assertion that we're just gonna that we're just gonna progress and progress and progress and never gonna be any the kind of where it became completely antithetical to scientists to even state that we could have like cycles, cyclical time. Um, I think all this stuff stems back to that era, right? This all kind of the seeds are planted with the Enlightenment and it's kind of grown over time and changed
Yes,
until we get to what we are now. There's always been this undercurrent of resistance to it. Like I said, like in the 1800s, you had Romanticism, the Gothics, decadence, in the 20th century you had expressionism and the surrealism and and these types of of course like symbolism which spread out between the two eras. You had all these art movements that were very often connected with spirituality, occultism, esotericism. A lot of these people were involved with the arts in that time period were also involved with the esoteric world. And I think there's always been this undercurrent of rebellion against that kind of consensus reality that was created by the Enlightenment. And I kind of see the work that I do as being in line with that 100% because that is really my artistic grounding. And I feel like black metal as a whole and of itself as well is artistically grounded in that era. There's a lot more in common with black metal with say the decadence and the expressionists and all these types of art styles. You know what I mean? And
yes.
I feel like a lot of black metal guys are inspired by that era as well. So I don't think I'm the only person who believes that.
It's interesting that you actually kind of like stole my next topic, or the conclusion to this topic, and I'm glad you said that black metal indeed is kind of like a continuation on this. And I also think that all the taboo breaking and all the kind of like nasty aspects of black metal should be understood as antinomian philosophical liberation liberative thing. I think it's also good and important collective shadow working to have these kind of outlets in society which can break taboos and to be disturbing. I think it's good to be disturbing with art. Either you stagnate.
Yeah, and I think it's important in a world that seems to, be this type of the consensus reality. I'm not, like I said, I'm not really talking about an anti-rationalism per se, but it is a real embracing of the irrational and the dark and this whole world. And I do think that it is in line with all these things from the past. I think it's very important. I think people had more of an understanding of that. I always bring up, I have an old Terrorizer magazine from the 2004 or something that I bought. That had like a whole big section about black metal, the first wave into the second wave era black metal. It was pretty cool. Had a lot of, also had a whole section about newer bands, and it was a really great resource for me when I got into black metal around that time, of all this, a lot of underground stuff as well. And it was not afraid to have this stuff that was like, politically incorrect. I feel like people had more of an understanding of this idea, because one benefit of the Enlightenment was the idea of classical liberalism, in the sense that no thought or idea is forbidden. Everything, like freedom of speech means that if you're making a piece of art, piece of literature, piece of music, nothing should be forbidden to you. You should be able to explore everything. You know, this was an Enlightenment idea that, of course, people like Marquis de Sade also were very much espousing. And I think that is one really good thing from the Enlightenment that I think is getting lost in this time period, and also just the understanding of that concept. Because the truth of that concept is what I mentioned earlier. When I got into black metal, it was about going beyond good and evil, about breaking all taboos, and not worrying about not worrying about stuff like, if not getting offended by things, like having that ability to not emotionally react to things and this kind of knee-jerk societal level.
Yeah, I
I think
also
it's
think,
important.
yeah,
It's important
yeah,
as an artist too.
definitely, and I think black metal is of the same ilk than some kind of a more raw stand-up comedy. I mean, we are in the era that people are going to definitely there is the censorship of stand-up comedy, and I think that's a very bad idea. And I think if, for example, we have been into black metal for decades now, I would assume, and into occultism too. And if we would have been born into some kind of like a communist, like totalitarian society, say the Soviet Union back in the day, then if we would have been like a black metal artist, I think it would have been the right thing to like espouse some kind of liberal Western ideas about something which the communist society was very opposed to. That would have been the black metal thing to do, as like a kind of taboo breaking and transgressive antinomianism. I must emphasize that it's really about the philosophical opposition. I think Ethan of Emperor fame said that they had this return of Emperor. I mean, like special gigs they played at some select festivals, and they had their original drummer Faust, who was convicted of murder back in the day. And some people were like complaining about that you have a ex-murderer in playing drums at a special gig. And Ethan, who seems to be very intelligent and very well mannered person, at least today, and he's a successful musician at his own right, said that maybe black metal isn't for you then. And I think that was like a very very clever comeback, in the sense that it really is that if you have a problem with that kind of stuff, maybe you shouldn't listen to black metal. But anyhow,
It's kind of ingrained in the genre. I mean, if you can just look at any basic breakdown of the genre and go, yeah, these guys like murdered each other, set fire to churches, murdered other people, like grave robbery. Like there's a lot of like a lot of guys in that time period were took it really far. You know what I mean?
yes,
Like more further than I would. I wouldn't. I don't feel a need to go murder somebody because I'm listening to black metal, right? But I think that, but I can appreciate I guess in a way I can appreciate that they did take it that far. You know what I mean? Like that they were that extreme. There's something to be admired about that, in my opinion, as somebody who likes extreme music, extreme art. The same thing, I love like extreme industrial music and noise music and dark ambient and these types of artists who are real like wacko outsider people. And I think black metal is that. Yeah. But I do think it comes down to black metal being an antinomian music that's for antinomian spirituality. And I think a lot of this kind of stuff, though, the kickback that a lot of people, I think black metal will get stronger because I do think it needs to feed a little bit on resistance. I've said that on my podcast. I actually think that a lot of the kind of uh, fake outrage and just kind of way people are trying to tame black metal is actually going to bring out the wolf in black metal even more. So I actually think it's good, and I feel like you can see that in the fact that there's actually quite a bit of amazing black metal coming out nowadays. Where the true people who are, I think it's easier to tell them apart now, and they're out there and they're making music, and I think that's part of the kind of a part of the mycelium, so to say, that we also belong to. You know what I mean? Like that, I've really felt that as I kind of grow my connections to other people and across the world through my podcast, that there are people spread out all over that are part of this kind of this cult. You know what I mean, so to say.
yes, it's almost like a mycelium tribe, and not in any kind of trite way, but I really mean like it's like a tribe in diaspora, in the sense that the similarities and the joined cause and the brethren-ship is so strong.
Yeah, it's definitely a spiritual lineage. Now, you could look at it as the children of Cain in also many ways. That's kind of the kind of symbolism I like to use is we are the offspring of the Nephilim spread out across the world. You know what I mean? The people who have been given the black flame and are out there. And like I said, one benefit of the internet is that it's becoming a lot easier for us to connect than it even was back in the day.
It's basically it is like a digital mycelium, don't you think?
Yeah, and then it
The
has
internet.
and it has real world benefits. I mean, you think about like connect on the internet, but then I know when Nas played in Finland last year, you got to meet up with him,
Yes,
or
that's all.
like this kinds of stuff. Like it becomes a real world thing as well because then we have these connections of the people who are for real, and then when we're actually able to be in the same room together is awesome. So I think it's just one of those things of we have to use the internet. The internet is a tool, and we have to use it and not be used by it. And as spiritual beings with the black flame, we have to learn how to use it and not be used by it. Just like with everything else in the world.
Yes, I think a good way to conclude this podcast and interview is that this old saying, or rather like a command, find the others.
Exactly. Yeah. Find the others and and in that process, we become stronger. Like I think we have to be powerful in and of ourselves and our own initiation, but so often is through conversation with the other, and so many in so many different ways, be it another person or the other as some type of entity, the other as a daemon. it's through this type of it's through the other that we truly find the transformation that we, in so many ways, if that makes sense. So
It definitely does. So, thank you, Karl, for this profound conversation and for sharing your insights. As we part ways tonight, I leave you with a thought from G.A. Lawrence, originally penned for the New Nebraska State Journal back in 1994. New land is harsh and vigorous and sturdy. It scorns evidence of weakness. There is nothing of sham or hypocrisy in it. It is what it is without an apology. Good night.